by third sector organisations, which the Scottish Government is working with.
And very briefly, Bob Doris.
Thank you, President Officer. Minister, would you agree with me that whilst we want to see increased breastfeeding rates, that it's not always easy or appropriate for all women to breastfeed? We shouldn't stigmatise those who find that they are unable to breastfeed. All mums need to be equally supported.
Minister.
I think Bob Doris raises a very important point, and I don't disagree with him. I think it is important that all new mums are supported, and I hope, as I've previously referenced, the Family Nurse Partnership is able to support mothers and families in all situations.
Question 6, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government when it plans to establish a specialist endometriosis centre within every NHS board in Scotland.
Minister Jenny Minto.
The role of specialist endometriosis centres in Scotland is to provide coordinated, multidisciplinary treatment to individuals with complex systems of endometriosis and to those requiring complex surgery. Scotland operates 3 centres in Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow. This was recommended as the optimal approach for effective treatment in Scotland by a specialist working group of expert clinicians and representatives from patient groups and Endometriosis UK. There are no plans to establish a specialist centre within every NHS board.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Local charities in the south of Scotland are dedicated to improving endometriosis treatment. One of them, Endo SOS, says this, and I quote, "Having local centres saves money for patients and the NHS. Travel times are reduced, missed appointments are lower, and referrals to specialist care is faster." They added, "We need more locations to support the rural population and to reduce diagnostic and general waiting times." So, will the Cabinet Secretary find some time to meet with me and local campaigners to discuss the need for a specialist endometriosis centre in the Borders?
Minister.
Thank Rachel Hamilton for that question, and if she's happy to have the meeting with the Minister, then I would be very happy to meet with her and her constituents.
Supplementary, Emma Harper.
We know that how substantial an impact endometriosis can have in women's lives. It's clear that we need to continue to press forward with research into this condition to ensure that the most effective treatment options and support can be provided. Can the Minister provide any further information regarding work which the Scottish Government is undertaking to support research into endometriosis-associated pain?
Minister.
I thank Emma Harper for that question. We are jointly funding a £250,000 endometriosis research project with the charity Wellbeing of Women. The research project, which will primarily be run by researchers at the University of Edinburgh, will look at the drug dichloroacetate, I think, in the management of endometriosis-associated pain, and it's a fantastic project. I was privileged enough to visit them in the summer. Additionally, in January 2023, our Chief Scientist Office announced funding for the EndoCan project led by researchers at the University of Edinburgh through a large-scale UK-wide trial. The research will investigate whether a cannabinoid can reduce endometriosis-associated pain. Funding of just under £300,000 has been committed to this 30-month project.
And briefly, Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As well as expanding the number of specialist endometriosis centres, it's also critical that the impacts of endometriosis are recognised in the workplace. I was pleased to learn that East Ayrshire Council have become the first local authority in Scotland to officially recognise the impact endometriosis has on female employees, taking on the endometriosis-friendly employer scheme. Can I ask the Minister what engagement she's had with the scheme and if she would take some necessary steps to encourage all councils to engage with this important scheme?
Minister.
I thank Carol Mochan for her question, and yes, I think these schemes are so important. I recently launched one within NHS, across NHS Scotland staff, with regard to menopause and various other areas, and I think it's incredibly important that workplaces absolutely appreciate the impact that various conditions have on their workforce and get the right policies in place to ensure that workers are able to be there and do the best in their jobs.
Question 7, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it has reviewed GP services model, including in relation to whether patients are getting appointments when they need them.
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, I'm clear that patients should always have access to general medical services, and that all local NHS boards should ensure that GP services continue to be provided to all patients. Patients should always be able to see GPs when they need to. 5 years on from the joint agreement between the Scottish Government and the British Medical Association on the 2018 GP contract, our health and social care partnerships have made significant progress in recruiting multidisciplinary teams to support general practices. We currently have over 4,500 staff working in these teams, providing services including physiotherapy, pharmacy and phlebotomy.
Pauline McNeill.
There are a rapidly increasing number of patients seeking GP appointments, but combined with cuts to Primary Care Development Fund, this demand is placing immense pressure on GP services and leaving many patients facing long delays or simply unable to get an appointment when they need one. GPs are often working double, if not triple, the recommended limit of 25 consultations a day, and Audit Scotland have said that the Government are unlikely to deliver their promise of 800 new GPs by 2027. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary to address the specific point about the design of the appointment system? And that is that some patients report that they use one system and they can get an appointment, and other patients report that the GP uses a completely different system and they have to wait longer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that really every patient across Scotland should expect the same design of service to get the same efficient service from GPs?
Also, dealing with a very specific issue that the member raises in terms of appointment system is that it's down to individual GP practices, because the vast majority of them are independent contractors. And it's their responsibility to design a system that best meets the needs of the contract in order to deliver appointments to patients. The member may be aware that in October we published the outcomes from what was the General Practice Access Principles work that was taken forward to look at helping to try and get greater consistency, and it made a set of principles that has asked GP practices to apply. But because of the independent contractor model, it is down to individual practices to decide on what the model is that they use locally.
Brief supplementary, Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Despite the heroic efforts of GPs and their teams, too many of our constituents are struggling to see their doctors. Earlier this year, a constituent in the Scottish Borders received a positive bowel cancer test, with a letter saying a blood test was urgent. The local GP practice said that an appointment would take at least 10 days. With cases like these right across South Scotland, isn't it time that the Scottish Government properly invested in GP services and matched the Scottish Conservatives' commitment to invest 11% of the NHS budget into primary care?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, we are investing in primary care services. Now, I recognise the concern that the member has raised, but there is a variation in how some GP practices operate. So there are practices in terms of how they operate. It depends on how they approach certain issues and how some patient services are actually being provided. And I've witnessed that firsthand from my own personal experience and also from my experience as Health Secretary. So it is important that we do make sure that people receive good quality services from GPs, which is why we're increasing recruitment of GPs, and also the number of speciality places which we're offering for training as GPs has been increased this year and will increase next year again in order to make sure that we continue to invest in primary care.
And very briefly, Willie Rennie.
I'm afraid to tell the Cabinet Secretary that the recruitment of those additional staff that he's talked about, pharmacists, physiotherapists, mental health staff, phlebotomists, is not progressing well in my constituency in North East Fife. I met GP practices last week and they told me about recruitment difficulties with NHS Fife. Would the Cabinet Secretary consider transferring responsibility for recruitment of those additional staff over to the GP practices so they can make some progress?
As briefly as possible, Cabinet.
Presiding Officer, the challenge with what Mr Rennie has actually suggested is that it introduces further variation, because different GP practices could take a different approach which might not involve the provision of the wider multidisciplinary team that we're trying to achieve. However, I have said to the BMA that I'm open to looking at alternative models from the existing model which we have operating, but the outcomes for patients must continue to be improved as a result of expanding a multidisciplinary team. And I'm more than happy to continue to engage with the BMA on this issue, but it is essential that we make sure that there is a consistency of approach on how the multidisciplinary teams are being provided across the country.
Thank you, and with apologies to those I wasn't able to call, that concludes portfolio questions on NHS recovery, health and social care. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.
Thank you. The next item of business is a statement by Mairi McAllan on A9 dualling programme. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and hence there should be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Mairi McAllan, Cabinet Secretary, up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you very much. Following the Deputy First Minister's budget statement yesterday, I'm very pleased to have the chance to provide more detail on completing the dualling of the A9 between Perth and Inverness. Now, I know that this statement is keenly anticipated, especially by those who are concerned to see safety improvements developed on the A9 and for the many Scottish communities and businesses for whom the A9 is essential. I am, Presiding Officer, acutely aware of the strength of feeling on this issue. This programme has faced challenges, and I acknowledge that it has not progressed at the pace we would have liked. There have, of course, been particular challenges with sky-high inflation causing slippage in major capital projects. However, the A9 is the backbone of Scotland. It must be safe, it must be reliable, it must be resilient, and that is what this government will deliver. When I assumed responsibility for Transport and Cabinet in June, my primary objectives for the A9 project were threefold. Firstly, to oversee amendments to Transport Scotland's approach to procurement of its design and build contracts, to improve prospects and to avoid a repeat of last year's experiences with the section between Tomatin and Moy. Secondly, to finalise a delivery plan for dualling the remaining sections of the programme, which foregrounded certainty of delivery, but also carefully balanced this against considerations of market capacity, affordability, and the need to minimise disruption on the network. And finally, in the meantime, to progress interim safety interventions short of and in anticipation of dualling. And I'll address each of these issues today. While focusing my remarks principally on the remainder of the programme, a word first on Tomatin to Moy. Following the outcome of the first procurement for the section, Transport Scotland undertook extensive market consultation with the construction industry in order to gather views on how its major roads projects could generate improved tender competition. As a result of this engagement, the new engineering contract with amendments was adopted for use on a new procurement for Tomatin to Moy. This change in contracting approach was welcomed by the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. The new engineering contract is preferred by the industry and is widely used across the UK, with the terms and conditions adopted by Transport Scotland now offering a more balanced approach to the sharing of risk between Scottish ministers and those with whom we contract. And I can confirm that on 11th December this year, invitations to participate in dialogue were issued to 3 shortlisted contractors, and it's expected that award of this contract will take place in early summer 24, with the completed dualling expected to be operational by the end of 2027. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government has been determinedly considering procurement options for dualling the remaining 8 sections. Options considered include procuring all projects using either a design and build contract or a mutual investment model known as MIM, used by the Welsh Government and a public-private partnership contract, or indeed, we considered a hybrid of both approaches. We've also considered carefully how works are sequenced to provide an efficient overall programme that's aligned with the market's capacity to deliver, which minimises disruption to road users, and which is achievable within the wider financial constraints. And of course, as the Deputy First Minister outlined yesterday, the UK, having not inflation-proofed their capital budget, has left us with a nearly 10% real terms cut in our capital funding between 23-24 and 27-28. So, Presiding Officer, this has been a complex exercise, but the Government has concluded that the hybrid approach is the best way to complete the A9 dualling programme. And I can therefore confirm that the Government will progress the 3 remaining A9 dualling projects at the southern end of the route via 3 capital-funded design and build contracts. We then anticipate progressing the 5 remaining projects in the north and central stretches via 2 resource-funded MIM contracts. That's subject to ongoing due diligence and further decision-making in late 2025 and will be based on an updated assessment of expected market conditions. And I can confirm today that in progression of this delivery plan, work will begin immediately on preparations for the procurement for the next design and build contract, which will be for the Tay Crossing to Ballinluig project, with the contract notice planned for publication in spring 24, and award anticipated in summer 25. In addition, procurement of the Pitlochry to Killycrankie project and subject to completion of statutory processes, the passive Burnham to Tay Crossing, will commence in summer 25 and summer 27 respectively. Then, subject to decision-making in late 25, procurement for the 2 remaining northern projects under a single MIM contract could then commence in winter 26-27, with the second MIM contract comprising the remaining 3 central projects commencing procurement in 28-29. This hybrid approach, Presiding Officer, will create a rolling programme of construction which will lead to the progressive opening of the dual sections. Under this new plan, by the end of 2030, we anticipate that nearly 50% of the A9 will be open as dual carriageway, rising to 85% by the end of 2033 and eventually 100% by the end of 2035. This means we will see significant benefits from the dualling programme years ahead of that backstop in 2035. And I should say we have published all of the details of this programme on our Transport Scotland website today. Now, as part of our work, we have also prepared updated scheme cost estimates for each project. The total cost of the programme is now estimated at £3.7 billion at April 23 prices. Now, when adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to £2.45 billion at April 2008 prices, which the Chamber will note is well within the original cost estimate of £3 billion at 2008 prices. Now, Presiding Officer, that's cost. I want to talk about safety. The improved safety expected from dualling is absolutely crucial. I wish to take this opportunity to offer my heartfelt sympathies and my condolences to anyone who's lost a loved one or indeed who has been injured in collisions on the A9. Dualling will see driver stress and accidents reduced. Likewise, the severity and journey times for emergency vehicles will also be reduced. Dualling offers resilience, limiting the need for lengthy diversions. At the same time, the A9 is critical to the movements of freight, business and leisure travellers. Dualling improves reliability and the average times of journeys by 20%. This is transformative for a route that offers 35%, that serves 35% of our landmass and carries around 10% of Scotland's GDP in terms of cargo. Investment in the route will help grow the economy, but the impact is wider than economic. The A9 is the backbone that connects central and Highland Scotland, and for the 10,000 people living along it, it is often the only connection to vital services. It will also maximise the range of opportunities for contractors and their long supply chains. Presiding Officer, this programme will ensure that the link between 2 of Scotland's great cities is safe and fit for purpose for everyone who needs to use it, both now and in the future. Comprehensive stakeholder engagement on this plan will begin early in the new year, building on extensive engagement to date. I will today write to interested MSPs, inviting them to a briefing in Parliament as a first step. Regular engagement will continue as the programme progresses, including, of course, with local communities and on their individual projects. In the meantime, anyone with an interest in the A9 can sign up for updates at www.a9dualling.scot prior to the full launch of a new A9 dualling website early in the new year. And we will also advertise engagement opportunities here and through traditional and social media. Presiding Officer, decisions to complete the statutory processes are now complete for over 92% of the programme. We will complete the statutory processes for the 3 outstanding schemes with ministerial consent next year and will acquire the necessary land to support the procurement timetable. The only project not to have yet started that process is the passive Burnham to Tay Crossing. I'd like to take the chance to thank the local community for their valuable input through the co-creative process, and today I can announce that the preferred route for this section is confirmed and that it includes a number of the elements of the community's preferred options, including a roundabout at Dunkeld and the junction layouts at the Hermitage and Dalgise. Further details of the preferred route, like the programme itself, are available on Transport Scotland's website, and local communities and roads users will have the opportunity to comment on the plans at public exhibitions in January. In the time I have left, Presiding Officer, I'd like to say a word on safety before concluding. Having updated on Tomatin Tamoy and the remainder of the programme, I just want to close with safety because since 2007, this government has invested £300 million in the maintenance and safety of the A9 and a further £3.6 million on average speed cameras. Following the tragic loss of life that occurred on the route, in particular in 2022, we've been investing an additional approximate £5 million. And I'm pleased to confirm that those safety measures are progressing at pace, with a number of elements completed. And of course, these include enhancements to signing and road markings, emphasis at junctions, and those vital transitions between dual and single carriageways. And as with the rest of the trunk road network, Presiding Officer, the safety performance of the A9 will continue to be regularly reviewed. Time is against me, but to conclude, this government is restating its commitment today to dualling the A9 between Perth and Inverness, and we're doing that with a concrete plan. The approach that I have set out means that the Highlands can have confidence that the considerable benefits of the A9 dualling programme will be delivered and in full. Now that we have reached this point, Presiding Officer, there will be no let-up. When construction starts on Tomatin Tomoy next year, under this delivery programme, it will roll continually until the route between Perth and Inverness is fully dualled. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes, after which time we will move on to the next item of business. And it would be helpful if those members who would wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement, although we have been waiting for this update since February, and here we are on the second last sitting day of the year. But our wait here is as nothing compared to the wait of the people of Perth and Kinross and the Highlands and Islands, who have been waiting for years to see this vital project completed, with an SNP government in power who have delivered a mere 11 miles of dual carriageway in 16 years. And throughout that period, too many lives have needlessly been lost, and more will die as a result of the delays we have heard about today. At best, we will be waiting another 12 years for this project to be completed, and that is the most optimistic outcome we can hope for. Now, the Cabinet Secretary did her best to deflect criticism onto the UK Government, but I would gently remind her that if the SNP had kept their promise to complete the dualling by 2025, then the challenges she identifies with inflation and her government's capital budget would not have been an issue. Now, today, Presiding Officer, we were expecting to hear that a contract had been placed for the Tomatin to Moy section. Even that has not been delivered. Instead, the best we have is an expectation that there will be a contract award in summer next year. So 1 year on from where we were at the start of this year, we are precisely no further forward. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary three things? Firstly, what guarantees can she give us that this contract award for Tomatin to Moy will now actually be done and on the timescale she has outlined, given all the slippage and timescales we've seen in the past? Secondly, in relation to the remaining sections, what confidence can we have that the timescales set out today are actually deliverable, even supposing that the funding can be found? And thirdly, how confident is the Minister that there is appropriate civil engineering contracting capacity to carry out these works? And what discussions has she held with industry to determine their willingness to tender for the contracts that are being proposed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Murdo Fraser for his question, and I should like to begin by acknowledging his point about a delay in my update. I had hoped to give this update some weeks ago, and I am always seeking to expedite progress in this regard. Unfortunately, the A9 dualling project is a complex project. Indeed, it's actually 11 complex projects, but as of today, it is a complex project with a comprehensive delivery plan, and I hope that even Murdo Fraser can welcome that. I think the critical theme in all of the points that he raises is about certainty, Presiding Officer. Certainty as regards Tomatin to Moy, certainty as regards the remainder of the programme. The plan that we've set out today has sought to foreground certainty of delivery. But as I said in my statement, we have carefully balanced that with the other factors that we must consider, namely the need to minimise disruption, market capacity and, of course, affordability. So with all of that taken into account, what we're publishing today provides the greatest certainty that I am able to provide, bearing in mind that this is a large project with significant complexities, significant interdependencies, all of which are actually susceptible to a variety of external factors, not least the financial volatility that we have become so accustomed to under Murdo Fraser's government.
I call Alec Riley.
Presiding Officer, the SNP first committed to dual A9 back in 2007. Today, 16 years on, and excuse after excuse after excuse later, the Cabinet Secretary expects us to be happy that by 2030, 23 years after the 2007 commitment, they will have completed less than 50% of this project. With a new date of 2035 for completion between Perth and Inverness, some 28 years after the initial promise, one has to wonder how on earth can the Cabinet Secretary say with a straight face that the Highlands can have confidence that the A9 dualling programme will be delivered and in full. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, does she have the confidence that this government is even capable of delivering infrastructure projects of this scale? Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this government has got a proud history of delivering major projects. Yeah, absolutely. There are a plethora of major projects, and I have absolute confidence, but I'm not complacent at the same time, and that's why we have spent time. And as I set out since I had responsibility for this, I've been determined to spend time finding all the ways possible to increase certainty in this project. That has involved updating our business case. It has involved spending considerable time, and Transport Scotland spending considerable time, engaging with the industry to update our approach to contracting under design and build contracts. And it has all brought together this new plan, which for the first time anticipates using a hybrid model of funding options that are available. So this is an example of the government using every tool at its disposal and working exceptionally hard to give the confidence to the Highlands and to everyone who I accept have been waiting too long, that this will be completed, and as I say, Presiding Officer, on a rolling basis of construction, with 50% completed by 2030, 85% by 2033 and 100% dualling by the end of 2035.
I call John Swinney to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Presiding Officer, in welcoming the reaffirmation of the Government's commitment to dual the A9, which builds on the successful completion of a range of capital projects, including the Queensferry Crossing, the M74 completion, the M8 completion, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route completion, the Airdrie to Bathgate Railway and the Borders Railway, and the acceptance by the Cabinet Secretary of a number of the proposals made by my constituents in the Dunkeld and Burnham area regarding the design of the route at that particularly challenging site. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree to further engagement from herself, the Transport Minister and their officials with community groups in Dunkeld and Burnham about the design issues and also, crucially, on short-term improvements that could be made to road safety in advance of the dualling works being undertaken?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr Swinney for so eloquently reeling off the plethora of major projects that this government can be very proud for having delivered. On the point about his locality, I would like to thank the Burnham to Ballinewig A9 Community Group for its work in working with us in a co-creative process which has helped to broaden our vision for the A9 dualling project through this really important route. The Transport Minister and I truly value the input that they have made to the process. And building on the positive relationship that's been established, I should like to reassure Mr Swinney that we will continue to engage with him, with his local community, and all of that as we continue to develop this section of the A9, which of course has taken a big step forward today. Indeed, I can advise that Transport Scotland officials are meeting the Burnham to Ballinewig A9 Community Group later this afternoon to discuss that preferred route option. And of course, as I mentioned in my statement, we will be holding those public exhibitions locally in January for the community.
I call Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
Time and time again, SNP ministers have come to this chamber, appeared in front of committees or pledged in public that the A9 will be dualled in full between Inverness and Perth and by the promised 2025 date. That was despite all evidence being to the contrary. We now know that since 2018 they were not being honest. The Scottish Government knew because officials told them that the 2025 date was unachievable. But it wasn't until last year, nearly 5 years later, that SNP ministers finally came clean. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, how can local businesses, those who live along the route of the A9 and those who've lost loved ones on the road, trust this government to finally deliver on these new, even more vague promises when they've been lied to so many times before?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm not sure that that was parliamentary language, but that is entirely your decision to adjudicate on.
Cabinet Secretary, please resume your seat. I heard what the member said and I noted carefully in the way in which he phrased it. It is, of course, absolutely unacceptable to refer to another member as having lied or being untruthful. I felt that the way in which it was phrased didn't quite fall within that bracket, and indeed it would be for me in the chair. Thank you.
Said it's for you to adjudicate on. The member's question centred on the inquiry that the Public Petitions Committee are currently undertaking, which is a retrospective look on the progress of the programme to date. I'm concerned that my statement today is about looking forward, but I have agreed to appear in front of the Public Petitions Committee to assist them in their important inquiry. And indeed, some of the documents that Mr Halcrow-Johnson referred to are part of the very many that the Scottish Government have handed over to the inquiry. I think Mr Halcrow-Johnson will find he'll have to correct the record at some point in the future. It was not, and the papers make this entirely clear, and I will certainly reiterate at committee, it was not until late 2022 that Transport Scotland knew for certain that the 2025 date was not deliverable. And a number of the papers that Mr Halcrow-Johnson is speaking to talk, for example, about moving only to a MIM model and the deliverability of that by 2025. They did not mention capital design and build. So, as I say, I'm happy to appear in front of the committee and discuss these matters on the retrospective account. I'm looking forward today with this optimum delivery plan.
I call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. Can the Cabinet Secretary say a bit more about the mutual investment model that she referenced in her statement, what it entails and what the advantages of it are?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to. The mutual investment model, as I said in my statement, is one that has been developed and used by the Welsh Government. It's a form of public-private partnership which is similar in many respects to non-profit distributing contract, which was previously used in a number of major road projects, including some of those that Mr Swinney narrated. Now, the principal advantages that such a contract offers is that it provides additionality of investment through the use of private finance to deliver infrastructure projects and reduces the level of annual expenditure by spreading payments over a longer period of time. It does, however, represent a significant long-term financial commitment and requires a detailed consideration of market conditions, especially inflation and the cost of borrowing. And that's why we, in a prudent manner, have built-in decision-making points within this programme where we will consider how appropriate it is to move to a MIM given prevailing market conditions at the time.
I call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the announcement that one section will be dualled in the next 4 years is not going to pacify the anger of my constituents due to the lack of progress. The Government knew it was not going to meet its 2025 promise, yet tried to hide that. Can I ask if she will give detail as to the key differences between design and build and mutual investment models and where the risk for each lies? And will she tell my constituents how they can realistically gauge progress towards completion for themselves, given the Government's deception in the past?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I hope that the member was listening to my response to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson when I made absolutely clear that it was not until 2022 that Transport Scotland knew for sure that 2025 was not achievable, and Scottish ministers updated the Parliament shortly thereafter. And I think that Rhoda Grant, in referring to one section being completed in the coming years, is missing the point that I've been trying to stress, which is that this is a 12-year programme, but one of rolling construction, so that when spades are in the ground for Tomatin and Tomoy section next summer, we will see rolling construction right through to 2035. And as I say, with that progressive opening, 50% by the end of 2030, 85% of 2033 and 100% by the end of 2035, so that people who I accept rely on this route so fundamentally can enjoy the safety and economic and other benefits that come from dualling in advance of the completion of the entire programme.
I call Fergus Ewing, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Presiding Officer, on the way to the Chamber this afternoon, and quite by chance, I bumped into an Invernessian who reminded me that he had lost friends on the A9, and that was a salutary reminder of the force behind this campaign. Presiding Officer, in any campaign, It's wise to accept victory where it occurs and to be magnanimous. And it is said that to be prepared is half the victory. And I think she will agree we're not as yet fully prepared. So will she acknowledge that many, including myself, will continue to remain sceptical until they see even the diggers on the road, and that the statement today, whilst on the face of it encouraging, involves a huge amount of work ahead? And so, in conclusion, there must be no more slippage, no more delays, and no more broken promises.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank Fergus Ewing for his contribution today, but equally for his determined campaigning on this matter. Of course, since I've been in post, but long before that as well. He mentioned in his opening remarks about the loss of life, and of course that is the principal issue at the forefront of this. I attended an event with Fergus Ewing over the summer, organised by the P&J and the Inverness Courier, where we were joined by family members of the bereaved. And I can assure Fergus Ewing and the Chamber that that experience will never leave me and has been with me in all the work that we've been seeking to do as a team ever since. I wouldn't expect Fergus Ewing to be anything other than sceptical, helpfully sceptical, I hope, moving forward, but I can assure him, as I have to other members, that what we've tried to produce today is the greatest possible certainty in a fairly uncertain world, and I can assure him that whilst I can't prevent issues from arising, where they arise, the Government will seek to overcome them and as quickly as possible.
I call Beatrice Wishart, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Kate Forbes. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday we heard of another serious crash on the A9 near Invergordon, and my thoughts are with those taken to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary after the collision. But this highlights the known dangers of the A9 in its current state. And there was news last week that in 2018 it was thought that the target to dual the A9 between Inverness and Perth by 2025 was unachievable. Yet ministers didn't change course to address this, and 77 miles of the A9 are still not dualled. The new timeline will mean years of delay from the original commitment, and I must say I'm surprised there was no apology anywhere in the Cabinet Secretary's statement about this. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, what guarantees can the Scottish Government provide this time that the new dates are realistic and we will see completion by the new date?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Beatrice Wishart, and I would echo to her what I have to Fergus Ewing and a number of others, which is to, I suppose, reassure her in the first instance that that certainty of delivery that she and others are seeking is what has driven the development of this plan. And whilst it would be a little foolish to suggest that in a project of this scale and this complexity that issues won't arise, of course they will, I give her the same commitment that I have given to Fergus Ewing and others, which is that when they arise, where they arise, the Government will seek to address them, and as quickly as possible. She's absolutely right to acknowledge the accident that occurred near Tomach this week. My sympathies and that of all my colleagues are with those who have been involved. We are awaiting further details, but I also want to thank the emergency services who were so promptly on the scene. But that relates to another part of Beatrice Wishart's question, which is about how the dualling is principally a safety issue. And I have very much at the forefront of my mind how driver stress, how driver frustration will be reduced by dualling, how the severity of accidents will be reduced by dualling, because we know it's head-on collisions which are the most difficult and fatal. And of course, emergency vehicles access will be quicker, not just where there's accidents on the road, but for the 10,000 people who live along the route.
I call Kate Forbes to be followed by Edward Bounton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My declaration of interest that I probably spend about 10 hours every week on the A9. The Cabinet Secretary may recall just a matter of weeks ago that the Tories said that dualling the A9 would take a century. So I've never been more thankful that she's in charge with an updated deadline of 2035 and not them. But can I also pay tribute to the Highlanders who've waited patiently for the A9 to be dualled, and their spokespeople, not least the Inverness Courier, who are here today. Certainty really matters, and in order to restore trust, we have to keep communities regularly informed so that there are no surprises. How do we do that so that they can trust the pronouncements made by the Government and that progress is genuinely being made?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. And I understand entirely the sentiments that Kate Forbes has expressed. My clear objective today is to set out that this is a new optimal delivery plan, and it is a concrete one, that the approach that we have set out means that people in the Highlands and those who travel there can have confidence that all of those considerable benefits of A9 dualling that we know exist will be realised and as efficiently as we can. And as I said, I will repeat, now that we have reached this point, there will be no let-up. Under this plan, under this rolling delivery programme, we will see continual work, continual construction until the route is finished. And she's quite right to point out that so-called research by the Conservative Party pointed recently to this potentially taking 111 years. I hope even they will welcome the fact that it is going to take about a tenth of that time.
I call Edward Mountain to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In the dark days of winter, we now get the promised autumn statement on the A9. I suppose better late than never, considering the time we've been waiting for this project. Considering the government's record, how can Scots believe that they can only deliver a miserable 7 miles a year of dualling to complete this project by 2035? Surely we should expect more in the fact that you failed to deliver a long-standing promise.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, again, I would just point out to Edward Mountain the irony, I suppose, that whilst his party were compiling what they call research, what I would call a little ridiculous, whilst they were compiling those press releases, thankfully the government, taking this serious issue very seriously, we're working hard to overcome the barriers that we need to in order to present this comprehensive plan today. And that includes, as I have said, looking closely at our business case, updating that, working with industry to improve the manner in which we procure, design and build contracts, and building this plan, which, as I've said, foregrounds certainty of delivery, but considers market capacity, considers affordability, and ensures that there will not be unmanageable disruption on the route. And I commend it to the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary has rightly highlighted safety on the A9 as being the overriding priority, and the Green Group are behind appropriate action needed to cut casualties and tragedies on the road. But given that the A9 programme won't be completed until the mid-2030s, can I ask what other options to improve safety on the A9 have been reviewed, while of course staying on track to meet our legally binding climate targets?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mark Ruskell for highlighting what, as I have said, is the principal driver of this work as far as the government's concerned, and that is the improvement of safety. As I mentioned in my statement, since 2007 this government has invested £300 million in the safety and maintenance of the A9 and a further £3.6 million on for average speed cameras, which I think everybody would accept made a difference, but do not go as far as dualling itself will. In addition, following that quite marked increase in accidents that occurred during 2022, we responded with an additional £5 million in road safety measures. These have included enhancements to signing and road markings, with a particular emphasis at junctions and that transition between dual and single carriageway, which we know can be difficult. So this introduction of average speed cameras, the work of Police Scotland, targeted education campaigns and the ongoing management and maintenance of the route have helped to reduce accidents and casualties from that long-term trend that we were seeing, with the exception of 2022, and that remains at the foreground of our thinking.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the statement, and apologies to those few members who I was unable to call. Point of order, Michael Gallagher.
I seek your guidance. The statement on the Scottish Government's response to the Section 35 Order Judicial Review was sent to me at 3:16 this afternoon. Statements are usually sent within sufficient time that allows MSPs to read over and scrutinise the Minister's statement prior to arriving in the Chamber. Sending a statement through 4 minutes before business is scheduled is discourteous to elected members in this Parliament. Therefore, can the presiding officer assist me in understanding why the government is withholding statements from MSPs until the last minute? And does she believe this is good practice, as MSPs are restricted from being able to do their job for holding this government to account?
I thank Ms Gallagher for a point of order. I would say that obviously in terms of the guidance from the presiding officer, provision of statement in due time is very important and is a mark of the government showing courtesy and respect to individual members. Vis-à-vis the specifics of this case, I would advise Ms Gallagher that the presiding officer herself, who will be taking the chair for the next item of business, will address that issue further. Thank you.
The next item of business is a statement by Shirley Ann Somerville on Scottish Government response to the Section 35 Order Judicial Review. Members will be aware that some of the content of this statement is in the public domain following media coverage. I have received a letter of apology from the Deputy First Minister, and it is appropriate that an apology is made to the Chamber. Members, I would be grateful if I could make my remarks. I have received a letter of apology from the Deputy First Minister, and it is appropriate that an apology is made to the Chamber. Ministers are answerable and accountable to the Parliament for their actions in their ministerial capacities, and it's essential that members, as elected representatives of the people of Scotland, have the first opportunity to hold ministers to account, and for that reason, announcements must be made here first. Having considered the content of the statement, I consider it important that I allow it to go ahead in part, and I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to focus on those matters that are not already in the public domain. And the Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I begin my statement, let me respond to your comments. Presiding Officer, media speculation on the Government's decision in relation to the Section 35 is deeply disappointing and regretful. I am aware that the Deputy First Minister responded to direct questions put to her, and whilst she did not confirm or deny if the Scottish Government intended to appeal the decision, she recognised the Government's position was inferred by the comments made. She in no way meant to preempt the statement today, and I know she has written to you to apologise for comments she made in response to the direct questions put to her in interviews on the budget. I would also like to apologise to you and the Chamber. The discussions between myself and your office, Presiding Officer, did lead to the late arrival to opposition spokespeople, for which I do genuinely apologise for that. Let me now return to my reduced statement. 1 year ago, this Parliament passed the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill after much discussion and careful consideration. Not everyone agreed with the bill, some strongly opposed it. But the will of the Parliament was clear. Two-thirds of this chamber voted to pass the bill, with members of all parties voting in favour. But within 4 weeks, the Secretary of State for Scotland blocked its submission for royal assent with the first ever use of a Section 35 order. Scottish Ministers petitioned for judicial review, as it was clear to us that allowing this unprecedented veto on a decision of this Parliament to go unchallenged would undermine the Holyrood's democratic will, and by extension the will of the people we are sent here to represent. First, let me be absolutely clear that the Scottish Government remains committed to supporting and empowering the LGBTQI+ community, including trans people. We will continue to build on our work across Government to strengthen this. We work closely with the LGBTQI+ stakeholder group and third sector organisations to ensure the voices of those with lived experience helps improve outcomes for these communities. We are also delivering the Non-Binary Equality Action Plan to improve conditions for non-binary community in Scotland, and the plan includes actions already underway, such as meaningfully including non-binary people in decision-making. We remain committed to consulting on an Ending Conversion Practices in Scotland bill for both sexual orientation and gender identity, and detailed proposals for legislative change will be published early in the new year. Conversion practices which aim to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity are damaging and destructive acts that violate the human rights of those who undergo them. We remain committed to our work with NHS Scotland to improve access to and delivery of gender identity healthcare. And we are working closely with people with lived experience, organisations representing trans people and NHS Scotland to implement the actions in the 2021 NHS Gender Identity Services Strategic Action Framework. We have established a National Gender Identity Healthcare Reference Group and commissioned a range of work including robust collation and reporting of waiting times, a transgender healthcare knowledge and skills framework with training opportunities for NHS Scotland staff, a programme of research on long-term health outcomes for people who access gender identity healthcare, and the development of national standards for accessing and delivery of gender identity healthcare. This work is well underway. We are also delivering the recommendations of the LGBTI Inclusive Education Working Group. The implementation group has, in partnership with COSLA, promoted effective delivery of LGBT inclusive education in all Scottish schools, engaging with young people to seek their views and experience, and are delivering improved learning environments for all children and young people. And before the end of the parliamentary year, we will bring forward a new human rights bill for Scotland. Let me now turn to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill specifically. The bill's reforms remain the government's policy, and as we can see from the cross-party support for the bill, they remain what this Parliament would like to see enacted. However, the UK Government's intervention means that the bill cannot proceed to royal assent. It remains a bill passed by the majority of this Parliament, and we will not be withdrawing it. There is a strong indication that any divergence of approach would be unacceptable to the UK Government. As Alistair Jack stated in the Westminster Parliament, in short, two different regimes create adverse effects. It is therefore impossible to see how progress can be made, particularly when the rules of this Parliament require that amendments at reconsideration stage are consistent with the Bill's general principle. If the current UK Government is willing to work together on this, we will happily sit down with them. If a future UK Government are willing, we will do so with them, so that the Section 35 could be lifted and the bill progresses. It seems clear that the current Government will not do this, and it remains to be seen what a future Government will do. Parliamentary discussion of the Scotland Act shows that the Section 35 power was always intended as a long stop or last resort, and one which would never be needed. It was envisaged that the UK Government should raise issues at an early stage and the two governments should seek to resolve them. That is in black and white, both in those devolution debates in the Westminster Parliament in 1998 and in the Memorandum of Understanding between governments. But that is not how the Secretary of State for Scotland used the power. It is the Scottish Government's view that this UK Government and the Secretary of State see Section 35 as a veto that they can apply to any legislation passed by this chamber that they disagree with. To ignore the Memorandum of Understanding sets a very worrying precedent for the democratic powers of this Parliament. Regardless of people's views and opinions on gender recognition, that is a very worrying place for our Parliament to be. Now, due to the intransigence of current UK Government, I am confident any repetition of our offer to seek compromise would again be rebuffed. We will therefore focus on working with an incoming UK Government, which we hope will have more respect for devolution and is willing to work together, even when at sometimes we disagree. Now, I recognise that many trans people will be disappointed by this decision. To them, I say this: the Scottish Government will never waver in our commitment to your rights. You deserve to be respected, included and supported. You are not a threat, and you will always be able to live your lives free from prejudice and abuse in the type of Scotland we all want to see. We will continue to work towards a society that is equal and fair, and where people can live as they are, just as we will continue to protect the democratic powers of this Scotland's Parliament.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business, and I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comments in relation to the late arrival of the statement. When Nicola Sturgeon said last year that this debate would be over by Christmas, I don't think she meant this Christmas. The Scottish Conservatives repeatedly told this SNP government that the Gender Recognition Reform Bill was fundamentally flawed. We warned all along that this would happen, but the SNP government didn't listen. Instead, they've spent time and taxpayers' money on a doomed legal battle to revive laws which the majority of the Scottish public do not want. Laws which undermine the rights and safety of women, girls and vulnerable young people. Women's groups were ignored throughout this whole debate, and I am delighted that their hard-fought campaign has been won. But this whole debacle leaves the SNP's relationship with the Greens in tatters. And I'm wondering if the Greens will follow through on their threat and quit the government after the announcement today. It might be a lot better for Scotland if they did. Cabinet Secretary, we know that self-ID has been a failed experiment that the Scottish public oppose. So can she outline whether lessons have been learned? And if so, can she reassure women's groups that their concerns will be listened to in the future to prevent this sorry saga from ever happening again?
Cabinet Secretary. Can I thank Megan Gallagher for her question and the way for which she took my apology. I know her and I have many crossed words, including yesterday, but I do appreciate the way that she's responded to my remarks today. Can I say, however, that there were not amendments at stage 3 that would have prevented, I don't think, the Secretary of State from taking a Section 35 order. And the reason I say that is because, as I mentioned in my original statement, he has been clear that he is concerned about a divergence and two systems being within the UK. Now, on that basis, it is genuinely difficult to see how we could have a bill that could be approved by this Secretary of State and in this UK government. When it comes to listening to diverging opinions on this, I appreciate in this Parliament and in wider society there are a range of opinions on this issue. I fully appreciate that. But those were listened to. We may not clearly have agreed with those, but I met, the now Deputy First Minister met, many ministers met. We had with groups who both agreed and disagreed with where the bill got to. And there were, of course, 2 public consultations. But I would say, as well, Presiding Officer, on this issue, what this legal judgment is about the use of Section 35. The judgment does not take any position on the Gender Recognition Bill itself and the merits thereof, and that is why the Government will not be withdrawing the bill.
Thank you. I call Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I add my disappointment to the late sight of the statement, but also accept what the Cabinet Secretary has said in mitigation. From the beginning of the process of gender recognition reform in Scotland until now, 6 years down the line, Scottish Labour has striven to ensure that the gender recognition reform legislation is progressive and updates the system whilst upholding rights and protections for everyone. We sought to engage all parties, including the government, from the beginning, raising potential issues, offering amendments and seeking repeated assurances that the legislation was secure in law. Indeed, the Cabinet Secretary will recall my own amendments this time last year and previous questions I have raised on issues like Section 104 meetings between both governments and calls to see the government's legal advice. Ultimately, I recognise this will be a difficult day for many people. Simplifying the process for gender recognition has not moved forward, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary outlining what further action the government will take to support trans people in Scotland, something I have been keen to raise each time we've had the opportunity to discuss the issue. So I would appreciate in her answer if she'd further outline how activity across government will be coordinated so as to measure improvements, particularly in healthcare. I recognise too that many women feel that the debate has dismissed their concerns, and indeed a common view that the debate has become too polarised. The Cabinet Secretary has essentially said that the bill will remain in limbo after the smoke from the court wrangling between the two governments clears. And I also heard what the Cabinet Secretary said about willingness to try and work together. So does she recognise that the court has judged that the bill modifies the law as it applies to reserved matters? And what analysis has the government carried out in light of those parts of the judgment that could form the basis for any future dialogue with the UK government on moving the process forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Paul O'Kane for his questions. With relation to the aspects on health, this is a very important issue, I recognise, for the trans community and something which the government has been working on already for some time. And I think it's important that I recommit the Government to that today. I've spoken about the Gender Identity Services and that Strategic Action Framework, and that describes how we are working to improve access to and delivery of NHS gender identity services. And importantly, I think we will continue, I know, to work with those with lived experience to ensure that matters are improved for them, not just in the healthcare sector, but in other aspects as well. He mentioned the Section 104. That's clearly a very different process and a technical process to ensure that bills can work correctly. Unfortunately, that would not have got it out of the situation again that we're in at the moment, because, as I've said already, the Secretary of State has made his position clear on having two different systems. But we will continue to work with any government on that issue. And I think it is very important that right across government we do work together to ensure that we are supporting the trans community in everything that we do, as well, of course, as continuing the work in delivering equally safe to protect women's rights and to protect them from violence and intimidation and discrimination.
Thank you. I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This time last year, the majority of MSPs in this chamber voted to respect the right of trans women and men to self-identify in accordance with their human rights. The intervention of the UK Government to block this has defied the democracy of this Parliament and shattered the trans community. Can the Cabinet Secretary expand on the decision taken by the Government following the legal advice?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, clearly it would be inappropriate for me to discuss the legal advice which the Government received. But what I would say, Presiding Officer, is that the judgment not to appeal, or the decision not to appeal this judgment, has not been an easy one. We've, of course, reflected on that legal advice and the policy advice covering a wide range of factors. I know that the legal process, this ongoing scrutiny that it brings, has taken its toll on the trans community. It is the Government's opinion, that the worst possible outcome would be to draw this out still further and still not be able to have a bill to enact. We want to avoid that outcome, and that's the reason why the Government has come to the decision that it has.
Miles Briggs to be followed by Karen Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When announcing the intention to take the UK Government to court 8 months ago, the Cabinet Secretary did tell Parliament that they were very keen to be transparent as possible on the matter. And whilst the Scottish Government have abandoned this legal battle against the UK Government, can the Cabinet Secretary actually now say whether or not the Government will publish legal advice? And given the Scottish Government have spent over £230,000 of taxpayers' money on this failed court action so far, will the Government also publish what estimated costs would have been incurred by the Government if they had challenged this ruling?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I've already said, Presiding Officer, the Government does not publish its legal advice. Neither will the UK Government publish its legal advice about the court decision either. So I do think it's a bit hypocritical for the member to suggest that the Scottish Government publishes advice, but I don't think, happy to stand to be corrected, but I don't think he would make the same call on the UK Government. And can I say gently, when it comes to wasting public money on court cases, the UK Government has spent more than £2 million on a case to ensure that they can, how to put it, how to take some of the most vulnerable people. You might find this funny, Scottish Conservatives, but I certainly don't. 2 million people to take some of the most vulnerable in our society, those that are persecuted right across the world, and send them to Rwanda was worth £2 million. And you have the hypocrisy to come to this chamber and actually criticise the Scottish Government for standing up to the powers of this Parliament. It's a shame the Scottish Conservatives have once again shown that they have no interest in defending this Parliament or democracy, but are quite happy to defend the Rwandan policy on immigration.
I call Karen Adam to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I firstly want to acknowledge the harm that this arduous process, particularly the UK Government veto and court ruling, has had on trans people, their families and their friends. Can the Cabinet Secretary update the Chamber on the significant impact the Section 35 order has had on devolution after being used in this way?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think Karen Adam is quite right to point out, one, the impact on the trans community in Scotland, but also, importantly, to talk about the impact on devolution. And that is exactly why the Scottish Government took this case in the first place, because we recognised that the UK Government has, unfortunately now, a record of attempting to undermine devolution. And this judgment absolutely is about how the Section 35 was used with respect to the gender recognition, but it is important that we continue in the future also to challenge on Section 35 orders. So I accept the judgment. I accept that Section 35 is part of the devolution process, but to have this being used in the way that it has is a worrying precedent for anyone that's genuinely interested in Scottish democracy, because there is an emerging pattern of interference. There was no deliberate breaches, presiding officer, for example, of the Seoul Convention for the first 20 years of devolution. Since 2018, we've now seen it breached 11 times. That's what happens when power goes unfettered, and that's why we will continue the challenge to the UK Government, if we choose to do so, in the future on any Section 35 that comes ahead.
I call Claire Baker to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So, a year on from the passing of this legislation, which is a sorry and salutary tale for the Scottish Government, they need to accept and reflect on their level of responsibility, not just for this failed piece of legislation, but how their actions influence wider discussion on this complex and sensitive issue. In her discussion of upcoming work, the Cabinet Secretary did not refer to the upcoming CAST review final report. Can I ask what plans the Scottish Government is making to respond to the CAST review final report, which is due in the new year? And can I also ask if the National Gender Identity Healthcare Reference Group is considering the delivery of gender identity healthcare for children and young people?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Claire Baker for her questions? I think there is something that we all need to reflect on with the Section 35 and the judgment around how this Parliament is treated. Regardless of how people's views were on gender recognition, there is, I think, an ongoing issue we now have over how Section 35 has been ordered. So, yes, clearly the Government will reflect. I would suggest there's a time for reflection for all of us on this. On the CAS review, the member will be aware the ongoing findings of the CAS review and their implementation by NHS England are being closely considered by the Scottish Government and NHS Scotland, and I would be happy to write to the member, or indeed to get the Minister more deeply involved in that, to write to the member on the specifics of that issue.
John Mason, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. I think the Cabinet Secretary knows that I was and am opposed to this bill, but Westminster should not be interfering in what is rightly Scotland's business. Is the Cabinet Secretary concerned that future UK governments may just use a veto just because they don't like our legislation?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, and I think this is one of the examples where the member on I would be fair to say have completely opposing views on the gender recognition bill, but he is quite right to point to the significance for this on devolution itself. And I think this was rightly also focused on by Mark Drakeford when he said that the UK Government's decision to use the powers that have never been used in the history of devolution is a very dangerous moment. The point I was trying to make to Claire Baker earlier on, this is a turning point in devolution, and it is up to all of us to reflect on what we do about that. Now, the Government has taken this matter to court. We absolutely, as I said, accept the judgment of the court on this and will not appeal. But I do think there's a worrying habit, can I put it, that the UK Government has about interfering in devolution, and I do fear that that habit may increase in the future.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Evelyn Tweed.
Presiding Officer, this bill commanded support from members of all 5 parties across this chamber because it sought to allow trans people to be recognised for who they are without trauma in the legal architecture that underpins their lives. Many trans people suffer discrimination and stigma every day. This process will have harmed them further and left them feeling let down and exposed. That is a great shame, and a humane approach to gender recognition is a problem that remains unresolved. They are now looking to us for meaningful progress against the other barriers that stand between them and equality, like a ban on conversion therapy and ready access to trans-inclusive healthcare. The Cabinet Secretary touched on some of these in her remarks, but to reassure those watching us today who are hurting, will she commit to a meaningful timeline of action and regular reporting to Parliament on each of these areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely. And I think Alex Cole-Hamilton is quite right to begin his remarks by saying that trans people simply want to be accepted for who they are. I think we should all be able to say that about all of our members of society. And I do appreciate they feel let down, they feel exposed and they will feel vulnerable. And there is a responsibility, I feel very heavily, on me and my government to ensure that we move forward with whatever we can do right across government on this issue. I give one example of that. We've already discussed healthcare, but I give one example, again, on conversion therapy. And we had fully intended to have that consultation out on the Ending Conversion Practices Bill by the end of the year, but we listened to stakeholders' concerns, both from faith groups and from LGBT groups, about the fact that they wish that to be in the new year, particularly because there is a time over Christmas and New Year that people may be feeling particularly vulnerable and may not have support services available. So that consultation is ready. It's absolutely ready to be launched right at the beginning of the new year when Parliament returns. And he has my absolute assurance on that the Minister will be taking that forward in due course. And either she or I would be happy to meet the member to discuss that in further detail.
We have much interest. I'd be grateful if we could have short and concise questions and responses to get as many members in as possible. And I call Evelyn Tweed to be followed by Russell Finlay.
Following the court's decision on the use of Section 35 to block the GRR bill, does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that devolution is fundamentally flawed and that only full independence can ensure that Scotland's democratic decisions are implemented?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I hear groans, presiding officer, from that, and they affirm that once again. So let me be very
the
clear,
Cabinet Secretary.
Let me be very clear, presiding officer. If the Scottish Conservatives don't want the conclusion to be that we need independence to ensure that the will of the Scottish Parliament is recognised, then they also have to reflect on the fact that Section 35 is a part of the devolutionary setup, but how it is used is very, very important to how this Parliament feels it's been treated and the respect that this Parliament is given. So anyone that's interested in actually getting devolution to work, which allegedly the Scottish Conservatives do, then they would actually also wish to reflect on the use of Section 35 as it goes forward and prove us wrong, prove there is a way to get devolution to work, because until then, the member is quite correct that only with independence will we have Scotland's democratic decisions implemented.
I call Russell Finlay to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, President Officer. Women across Scotland were told that their views were not valid. So I applaud their hard-won victory with the SNP's dangerous GRR bill in the bin where it belongs. But I would like the Cabinet Secretary to explain why female prisoners are still being used as guinea pigs in the SNP's gender self-ID experiment. Why should the most vulnerable women in society be told to accept that a rapist like Isla Bryson or any other male-bodied sex criminal is a woman?
Cabinet Secretary.
Once again, for the avoidance of doubt, presiding officer, this bill is not in the bin and it awaits an incoming UK government that has more respect for devolution. Can I also point out to Russell Finlay that the examples that he gives are under a gender recognition certificate process that is there throughout the UK, that is also there for many, many years. So what has happened within the Scottish Prison Service has nothing to do with gender recognition certificates, and he should not conflate the issues. He will also be well aware of the recent Scottish Prison Service policy on this, and I would refer him, if he's genuinely interested in the safety of women and transgender prisoners, to look at that in detail.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Ash Regan.
Thank you. The court ruling 12 days ago came as a bitter blow to trans people across Scotland. I know many of them are feeling very hurt and vulnerable right now, and they now have to wait indefinitely for the reforms that the legislation we passed here overwhelmingly 12 months ago would have delivered. Trans people are targets just because of who they are. Given that their lives have been and continue to be weaponised as part of a toxic culture war, what assurances can the Cabinet Secretary give to trans people who need some hope, some clear demonstration that they matter and that we value them?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Maggie Chapman for her question and put on record my thanks to her for all the work that she has done on this issue over the years, and I look forward to continuing to work with her as we move forward to protect and enhance the trans rights. It is very important that we do provide the reassurances that she asked for. I hope that my words today in some way go to reflect my concern over the trans community's vulnerability at this difficult time and the Government's commitment on this issue.
I call Ash Regan, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Last year, the Scottish Government told us it's just a small admin change. It grants no new rights. It does not interfere with the operation of the Equality Act. Safeguards are not required. No evidence of harm to women, all of which were wrong. This sorry and sad episode has created a culture where women were dismissed as transphobes and bigots. The Scottish Government failed in its duty to analyse the potential impact on women, and they misled this Parliament. They must provide clarity on next steps, as this bill must never be implemented. I renew my calls for the Government to apologise, as their conduct has fatally undermined public trust in government, and they have no one to blame for that but themselves.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would say to the member that although the Scottish Government introduced this bill, it was passed by Parliament. This is now Parliament's bill, and this Government will protect the will of Parliament in any way we can. I would also say to the member, as I've said before, that this judgment was about how the Section 35 was used with respect to GRR. It did not discuss the merits of the bill itself, and it's very important that these two items are not conflated.
Thank you. I call Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I fully welcome the Scottish Government's ongoing commitment to LGBTQ people and hope that the trans community will be offered the relevant support in the days and weeks following these events. Can the Cabinet Secretary share further information on the reason behind the Government's decision not to appeal?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I've laid out already in some of my answers, Presiding Officer, the decision for that was one for the Government taking a view of not just the legal advice but the policy advice we had, reflecting on that and reflecting on our views that to carry this process on would impact again negatively on the trans community, and we feared that the bill, because of the Secretary of State for Scotland's intransigence on this issue, would still not be able to pass, and it is for those reasons we chose not to appeal.
Call Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Michelle
Thank you,
Thompson.
Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives warned time and time again that the SNP Green Gender Self-ID Bill threatened women's single-sex spaces, and that was proven by the case of Isla Bryson, and would have impacted on equality laws right across the United Kingdom. If the SNP was so caring of the impact of their GRR bill on vulnerable women, why did they vote against these key amendments?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, Presiding Officer, I fully respect that the member and I have very different opinions on this bill. And I appreciate there are different views on this bill. But I am very, very firm, once again, on my opinion that we can improve the rights of trans people in our society, one of the most vulnerable and marginalised groups in our society, while ensuring that we protect women's rights as well. And I would make the point, Presiding Officer, that there are no amendments that came forward at stage 3, even if the government had accepted all of them, that would have prevented a Section 35 based on the Secretary of State firmly believing, as he has said in the House of Commons, that he does not believe in having two systems within the United Kingdom. And on that basis, that is where we run into an intractable problem. But that is why we will continue, yes, to support trans rights, but also always to support women's rights and protect women from discrimination.
Call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Douglas Ross.
Regardless of the various views of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, I think we can all agree it didn't quite work out as intended. Indeed, it's soured relationships across multiple groups in our society. Our job is simple: to scrutinise and pass good, competent law at best value to the public purse. With this in mind, will the Cabinet Secretary outline what specific review processes the Scottish Government plans to undertake on its role and the outcome we have here today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, I would say to the member, I think we are in danger of conflating a judgment which was based on the use of the Section 35 order on Gender Recognition Bill on the merits of the Gender Recognition Bill itself. The bill, as it was passed by the vast majority of this Parliament, remains a bill that this Government would like to see implemented. So, of course, we will reflect on this judgment. Of course we will. But we will also, very importantly, reflect on the use of the Section 35 order and how that impacts on the devolutionary process, because that is what the judgment was all about.
And Douglas Ross.
The Cabinet Secretary has spoken a lot today about diverging views and having respect. Many women and girls oppose the SNP Green legislation to protect their rights and safety. Therefore, on behalf of the Scottish Government, will she thank them for everything she did during the course of the passage of this bill for standing up for those freedoms?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there were obviously diverging views within the Scottish Conservatives on this bill, as well as members of Douglas Ross's group voted for it, and the majority, I accept, voted against. And what I would say is that every single member of this Parliament, I have no doubt, Presiding Officer, respects the rights of women and respects their need for protection against discrimination and violence. And that is something which this Government and I think this Parliament has already demonstrated on many occasions in the past and will continue to do so in the future.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. Point of order, Sue Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Throughout the previous statement, the Cabinet Secretary made reference to the fact that there were no amendments presented at stage 3 that would have not resulted in divergence from UK legislation. There were. They were presented in my name. Thank you.
I thank Ms Webber for her contribution. I do not believe it's a point of order, but it is on the record. We will now move on to the next item of business, which is stage 3 proceedings on the Trusts and Succession Scotland Bill. I'll allow a couple of minutes for front benches to organise themselves.
Okay, the next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Trust and Succession Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 21A, the marshalled list, the supplement to the marshalled list, and revised groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 45 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons to speak, or if they're joining us remotely, place an RTS in the chat function, but to do so as soon as possible after I call the group. Members should now refer to the marshalled list. Oh. Anybody that wasn't paying attention is now paying attention. Should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. Okay, Group 1, the resignation and removal of trustees, and I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 2, 2A, 3 and 4. Minister to move Amendment 1 and speak to all the amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Currently, the amended Section 5 provides that a sole trustee must have accepted office in writing or otherwise have acted in such a way as to indicate that they have accepted office. I understand that the policy intention behind the Stage 2 amendment was to make sure that the office of sole trustee is not forced upon someone against their wishes. Amendment 1 provides flexibility in the way that the office can be accepted, but does not fundamentally alter the policy intention. A sole trustee would still have to accept office, but this could be done verbally, in writing, or by some other means. Deputy Presiding Officer, moving on, I intend to support Stuart McMillan's amendments. Amendment 2, if amended by Amendment 2A, will mean that where there are 2 or more professional trustees appointed who are each no longer a member of the regulated profession or are not entitled to practice, when it comes to a decision to remove either of them, neither of those trustees are to be regarded as able to make the decision. This will prevent a potential and undesirable impasse. I understand that Mr McMillan, in light of comments from the Law Society, has decided not to proceed with part of the amendment which would have built on the Stage 2 amendment I brought forward, which allowed co-trustees to remove one of their own, where the trustee being removed has been appointed in their capacity as a member of the profession, but ceased to be a member of that profession and extended it to the professional trustees who provide their services through a company or partnership. I understand that whilst the Law Society agree with the principles, they have concerns about potential unintended consequences. It is therefore sensible to take more time to look at this issue, and I will be happy to continue working with the member to consider how any further changes may be made in other legislation. Amendments 3 and 4 are in my name. A person who has been removed from office as trustee may require to take certain actions after being removed. This might include updating information held in statutory registers, and failure to do so may result in criminal liability. While I believe that in the overwhelming majority of cases, trustees would take the sensible action of informing removed trustees of their date of removal, but I understand that this is not always the case. For example, in a small family trust, relationships between trustees may be so strained that what appears to be sensible and practical to us is not to them. My amendments provide a clear statutory statement that will be of assistance to professional and non-professional trustees. Where a trustee is removed from office, they must be given notice of their removal as soon as reasonably practical after the decision is made. Deputy Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 1 in my name, and I would ask the Chamber to support the other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Minister. And I call Stuart McMillan to speak to Amendment 2 and the other amendments in the group. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to speak in Amendment 2 and 2A in my name, and these are handout amendments from the Scottish Government after discussing an amendment that I proposed with the Government. I want to thank the Scottish Government who have worked with me on this particular issue. Amendment 2 came about because of an issue raised with me by constituents And the existing provision provides a loophole, such as if a trust has 3 trustees and 2 of the trustees appointed are referred to in subsection 1 of section 7, i.e. incapable, convicted of an offence involving dishonesty, sentenced to imprisonment on conviction of an offence, or imprisoned for contempt of court or for not having paid a fine. Now, when it comes to a decision to remove either of them, neither of those trustees are to be regarded as being able to make a decision. Thus, the majority for making a decision would be 1. This would help to maintain the integrity of any trust. The subsection 1D goes further, as the Minister touched upon, including also members of the regulated profession. On Friday, the Law Society were in contact with the Scottish Government to highlight 2 potential unintended consequences of 1D. Hence the reason for the manuscript amendment 2A, which I'm grateful, Presiding Officer, for you agreeing to accept.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the member to give way on that point. And we heard from the Minister guiding the legislation that this will be looked at going forward. Is the member aware of any specific legislation that may be available over the next few years of this Parliament that any changes could be encompassed in?
Stuart McMillan.
Discussions I've had with the Government centre around the bill that's currently going through the Parliament, the regulation of legal services. So that's certainly a piece of legislation that I will be working with the Government on to try to tighten in this particular regard. So the Law Society has advised the following. Firstly, that the provision could be used inappropriately, and secondly, that it would act as a deterrent to the use of corporate trustee bodies, and that this would have an economic impact. Presiding Officer, I don't fully agree with the considerations from the Law Society, but I do respect their opinion. I was therefore content to attempt to go part way to fixing this issue as compared to not trying at all, hence the reason for the manuscript amendment. So I therefore ask members to support Amendment 2 as amended by Amendment 2A. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In this first group of amendments, I want to put on record that the Scottish Conservatives will be supporting all amendments in these Stage 3 proceedings and to recognise the work of the Minister to listen to stakeholders and to the DPLR Committee in order to strengthen the legislation at Stage 2 and again today. Given the explanation we've had from Stuart McMillan and the addition of the manuscript Amendment 2A, we are content that the amendments before us represent the views of stakeholders and strike the right balance. I therefore don't plan to make any further comments in relation to the other amendments this afternoon, and will pick up some broader points in the main debate. I understand my colleague Jeremy Balfour may have some further comments in relation to some of the amendments which he continues to take an interest in. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call the Minister to wind up. Anything to add, Minister?
Just moving the amendment.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Stuart McMillan, already debated with Amendment 1. Amendment 1, Stuart McMillan, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 2A in the name of Stuart McMillan, already debated with Amendment 1. Stuart McMillan, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 2A be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. Stuart McMillan, to press or withdraw Amendment 2 as amended. Mr McMillan.
To press.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 2 as amended be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. The Minister to move formally.
Move. Presiding.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister to move.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. We move to Group 2, minor and technical changes. I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 5 and speak to all other amendments in the group. Minister.
Move, Presiding Officer.
You don't want to speak to the amendments, or you're just going to move?
Sorry, we're moving on to the next session.
We're on to Group 2, Minister.
Group 2, sorry. Apologies. Sorry, it's my first time at a Stage 3.
You've got somewhere you need to be, I think. Yes. Anyway.
Deputy Presiding Officer, Section 12 of the Bill is generally a default section which applies to a trust unless the trust deed provides otherwise. At stage 2, my amendment to this section was accepted. It provided that in a public trust, a trustee should not be disqualified from taking part in the decision-making process because they are part of the section of the public which the decision is intended to benefit. Stakeholders have since pointed out that the large public trusts may be intended to benefit the public at large rather than a particular section of it. My Amendment 5 and 6 take this into account and clarify the matter. These amendments will not allow a trustee to participate in decisions in which they have a particular interest specific to them as an individual. Going on to Amendments 14 and 15 in my name, these pick up on a concern raised at committee at stage 2, which was voted on but defeated. Having discussed the matter further with the Law Society and the Scottish Law Commission, I have decided to bring forward today these amendments slightly adjusted from those lodged at stage 2. My view is that these amendments are able to deal with the issue identified by the Law Society without unnecessarily widening the protection that Section 30 offers to beneficiaries. Deputy Presiding Officer, now turning to Section 32 of the Bill, this provides that as a default provision, a trustee is personally liable for any loss to the beneficiary which arises either from the trustee's own acts or omissions, or for any loss to the beneficiary which arises from a co-trustee's breach of trust or breach of fiduciary duty in certain circumstances. Some questions have been asked about how this section interacts with other sections of the Bill on trustee liability, and I think that this matter can be usefully clarified. Therefore, Amendments 16 and 17 will make clear that a trustee's personal liability in terms of Section 32 is to be read together with the Bill as a whole. Section 32 will not impose an unqualified personal liability for losses sustained by a beneficiary as a result of the trustee's actions or omission. Amendment 18 is a minor amendment meant to ensure consistency of terms used in certain sections of the Bill imposing personal liability on trustees. In some sections, the drafting used is private property, and in others it is personal property. This amendment means that the term used throughout the Bill will be private property. Amendment 19 replicates change made to Section 35(3) at Stage 2 so that the Bill is consistent. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, my Amendment 20 is a minor amendment meant to ensure consistency of drafting. While this amendment substitutes wording, it does not affect the underlying policy intention. I move Amendment 5 in my name, and I ask the Chamber to support the other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Minister. No other member is asked to speak. If there's no other points the Minister wishes to make, I'll ask the question that Amendment 5 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 5. Minister to move formally.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. We turn to Group 3, Sale of Heritable Properties to Charities. I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I call on the Minister to move Amendment 7 and speak to all the other amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Section 17B of the Bill was added by Jeremy Balfour's amendment at Stage 2 of the Bill. This amendment allows a charitable trust to sell heritable property, such as an old church building or a town hall, at less than best value if the purchaser is another charitable trust. At Stage 2, I express my concern about the drafting of Section 17B and the concerns of the Scottish Charity Regulator. Amendments 7, 8, 9, 10 and 12 in my name are in an attempt to bring the section more into line with similar provisions in the Bill on Trust Law and link the section more closely to charity law. Firstly, my amendments make sure that the charitable trust selling the property must have the power to do so, and charity trustees must have regard to their statutory duties under charity legislation. This will help to prevent situations where charitable trustees sell heritable property that is essential to delivering the Trust's purposes. My amendments also seek to widen the scope of Section 17B so that all kinds of charities in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK can benefit from Jeremy Balfour's amendment. Currently, the purchasing charity must take the legal form of a trust, but currently only 12% of registered charities in Scotland do so. My amendments will allow a charity registered in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK taking any legal form to benefit from this section. I understand that charities often work across different jurisdictions in the UK, and this amendment will be of benefit to them. The amendments also include a power to broaden this out in the future. Finally, Amendment 11 is a transitional amendment that applies this section to all charitable trusts created after the section comes into effect and is without prejudice to any current common law position. I would like to pay my thanks to Jeremy Balfour for engaging constructively with me on this issue. I move Amendment 7 in my name, and I ask for the Chamber to support the other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Minister. Again, no other members have asked to participate in the debate. And Minister, I would invite you to wind up. Is there anything else you wish to add?
No, thank you, Presiding Officer.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendments 8, 9, 10, 12 and 11, all in the name of the Minister and all already debated with Amendment 7. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 8 to 10, 12 and 11 en bloc. Minister.
Moved en bloc, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I would ask if there are any members who object to a single question being put on Amendments 8 to 10, 12 and 11. No. Then the question is that Amendments 8 to 10 and 12 and 11 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. We turn to Group 4, nominees, regulations about what constitutes a good cause, sub-custodians. I call Amendment 13 in the name of the Minister. In a group on its own, and invite the Minister to move and speak to Amendment 13. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. One specific issue that surfaced during the Stage 1 proceedings concerned the use of nominees and sub-custodians in certain situations. Amendment 13 is in response to those views that Section 19, as drafted, might not go far enough in capturing the ways in which trusts are used in the financial services sector. This is an extremely technical matter involving financial regulatory arrangements and how trustees can use A, nominee custody structures and B, sub-custodians. My officials have been discussing this matter, but it has not been possible to reach a conclusion in time for Stage 3. Clarification may nevertheless help to alleviate concerns that trustees will not be complying with trust law where they use custodian arrangements in practice. Accordingly, Amendment 13 introduces a narrow power to allow Scottish ministers by regulations to specify particular circumstances which may constitute a good cause for the purpose of Section 19(8). My view... Yes?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Minister to give way on that point. And are there any current circumstances being considered for regulation in the near future?
Minister.
Yes, thank you. We could look at it in the future, in future legislation, but it is what at the moment, because we couldn't get it in time for Stage 3. This is a sensible approach to allow us to address the situation which was addressed by the committee. If we did nothing, then it would have been a lost opportunity. Accordingly, Amendment 13 introduces a narrow power to allow Scottish ministers by regulations to specify particular circumstances which may constitute a good cause for purpose of Section 19(8). My view is that this negative procedure is appropriate for making these regulations, as they will allow illustrative provision to be provided only as an example of what the Court could allow in connection with the delegation of trustee functions. And I move Amendment 7 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. No other member has asked to speak. Does the Minister wish to add anything further?
No, thank you, Presiding
No.
Officer.
The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I call Amendments 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20, all in the name of the Minister and all already debated with Amendment 5. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 14 to 20 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Presiding Officer.
Does any member object to Amendments 14 to 20 being put under a single question? No. The question is that Amendments 14 to 20 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We move to question 5, protectors. I call Amendment 21 in the name of the Minister in a group on its own. Minister to move and speak to Amendment 21. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. A protector's function is to ensure that the trustee of a trust is appropriately discharging their duties. While it is almost certainly possible to provide for a protector under Scots law currently, the bill provides legal certainty on this matter. Section 49 of the bill also provides a statutory list of example powers which a trustee may confer upon protectors. Ultimately, it will be up to the trustee to decide whether any particular power is conferred on any particular protector, and this will depend on the individual circumstances of each case. Having considered the drafting of the list of example powers further, and having heard further from the stakeholders, I've concluded that some of the powers could be stated differently so that they are more in line with the protector's role. Amendment 21 does that. It removes the illustrative references to protectors directing trustees as to who may enjoy a beneficial interest, and its place provides a more consistent approach to the list of illustrative powers that may be conferred on protectors. Deputy Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 21 in my name.
Thank you. Again, no other members have asked to speak. Minister, anything you wish to add? No. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. We move to Group 6, trusts which may have their purposes altered. Call Amendment 22 in the name of the Minister in a group on its own. Minister to move and speak to Amendment 22. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Section 61 of the bill is about the alteration of trust purposes and attempts to balance the trustee's wishes against the wishes of beneficiaries before an application can be made to the court to alter trust purposes. When the bill was introduced, this section did not apply to private purpose trusts or public trusts, but after consultation with the Scottish Law Commission about the policy behind this section, it became clear that it should apply to private purpose trusts. When the section was amended at Stage 2, the exception for public trust was removed unintentionally. This is contrary to the intention behind the section, which is that the trust purposes of public trusts should not be altered by the way of an application under Section 61. Amendment 22 resolves both these issues, and I move Amendment 22 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. No other members are sought to speak. Is there anything else you wish to add, Minister? No. The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed, and that ends consideration of amendments. At this point, as members will be aware, at this point in the proceedings, the presiding officer is required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in her view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, in the presiding officer's view, no provision of the Trusts and Succession Scotland Bill relates to a protected matter. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to be passed at Stage 3. Before we move on to the debate, I call on Angela Constance to signify Crown consent for the bill. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, for the purpose of Rule 9.11 of the Standing Orders, I wish to advise the Parliament that His Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Trust and Succession Scotland Bill, has consented to place his prerogative and interests, so far as they are affected by the Bill, at the disposal of the Parliament for the purposes of the Bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next item of business is a debate on motion 11699 in the name of Siobhan Brown on Trust and Succession Scotland Bill. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Siobhan Brown to speak to and move the motion. Minister, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by thanking the members of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their thoughtful and helpful consideration of the Trusts and Succession Bill. I very much welcome their thorough scrutiny of the bill. I would also like to thank the committee clerks for all their hard work and those stakeholders who contributed views and their time as part of the parliamentary scrutiny of the bill. This bill is a Scottish Laws Commission bill, and I would therefore like to thank them for their considerable work which went into this law reform project. In particular, I would like to thank Lord Drummond-Young, who, even though he is no longer chair of the Commission, has given his time very generously. And I know that he is in the public gallery this afternoon, along with Lady Payton and Charles Garland from the Commission. The Scottish Government has also had some very useful engagement with a number of stakeholders. My officials have met with the Law Society of Scotland on several occasions. They've met too with the Society of Trusts and Estate Practitioners Scotland and the Office of the Charity Regulator in Scotland. Their practical experience was especially important in helping me reach policy decisions on the content of the bill. Throughout the process, I've listened carefully to the views expressed to the Scottish Parliament and to those of the committee, and the bill was amended as a result. I was happy to lodge amendments at stage 2 to implement some of the committee's thoughtful recommendations, particularly in relation to the package of amendments aimed at increasing the safeguards for sole trustees. This was a particular concern raised by the committee after hearing evidence directly from trustees. I've also been pleased to support some of the amendments made by the committee at stage 2, and I've had very helpful engagement with Jeremy Balfour. For example, Jeremy Balfour's amendment that extended and indeed doubled the time limit during which a cohabitant has the right to make a claim on the deceased cohabitant's estate where there is no will. We have also agreed adjustments to others today to ensure that they work as intended. The bill also addresses some important issues where someone has died without leaving a will, which is unfortunately a relatively common occurrence. I'd like to briefly remind the Chamber about some of the key provisions in the bill and what they are intended to achieve. Most of the provisions in the bill relate to the law of trusts and can be found in Part 1 of the bill. The bill makes important changes to the powers of trustees. The current legislation, dating back to 1921, no longer gives trustees the powers they need to administer a trust effectively, making it difficult for trustees to comply with their paramount duty, which is to give effect to the trust purposes in the best interests of the beneficiaries. An important reform is the conferral of a default general power, which replaces what is an inflexible, complex and restrictive statutory list of powers. And as a result, trustees will be able to have all the powers that a competent adult has in relation to their own property. The bill will also reform the duties placed on trustees. These changes will better reflect the need for transparency in modern-day trusts. For example, the bill will clarify what information a beneficiary is entitled to, expect or request from the trustees. The information duties of the trustees go to the heart of trust law, and these reforms will enable beneficiaries to exercise their power to hold the trustees to account. The bill also makes a number of important changes to the way that trusts are administered and how trustees are appointed, removed or resign. Many people in the Chamber today may be aware of the fallout from the failure of McClure's solicitors, perhaps through their constituents. I was pleased that collectively we have been able to bring forward amendments at stage 2 and 3 to respond to the significant practical difficulties that co-trustees may have in removing a trustee who was appointed as a trustee in their professional capacity and is no longer a member of their profession. The bill cannot resolve the wider issues caused by the collapse of McClure's, and I know that this is a matter that Stuart McMillan has a keen interest in, and we recently met to discuss what could be done to help those who have found themselves caught up in this situation. I welcome the engagement with Stuart McMillan on this issue, and I look forward to working constructively with him on those matters in the future. Part 2 of the bill deals with some reforms of the law of intestate succession. The bill will implement a Scottish Law Commission recommendation of 2009 so that where a person dies without a will and is survived by a spouse or a civil partner but not by children, the spouse or civil partner will inherit the whole of the net intestate estate. The Scottish Government consulted on this back in 2015 and there was agreement with this proposal, and the Scottish Government's response committed to implementing the recommendation. I am pleased that we have therefore been able to address this issue, which, depending on the composition and size of the estate, can result in the bulk of the estate passing to parents or siblings rather than the surviving spouse. This is not what people expect to happen, and the bill will remedy this situation. The opportunity has also taken to amend Section 2 of the Succession Scotland Act 2016 to clarify the drafting so that it is not open to any unintended interpretation. Finally, in respect of reforming the law of succession, I was very pleased to table amendments at stage 2, which will address the unacceptable prospect of a convicted murderer continuing to act as an executor to their victim's estate. There is some uncertainty about the current position in Scots law, and the amendments will place beyond any doubt that an executor who is convicted of or is being prosecuted for the murder or culpable homicide of the deceased will be regarded as unfit for that office and can be removed by the court, and that a sheriff must refuse any application for appointment as an executor dative in the same circumstances. These amendments fulfil a previous commitment made by the Scottish Government. They also implement a recommendation made by the committee, and I hope that they will bring the necessary legal certainty to those who are currently experiencing this difficult situation. I am convinced that the provisions in this bill will result in reforms to the law which will be of benefit to all of those involved in trusts. I move that the Parliament agrees that the Trust and Succession Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Oliver Mundell, around 6 minutes. Mr Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in today's debate and to confirm that the Scottish Conservatives will be supporting the bill at decision time. As the Minister has already outlined, this is the first major overhaul of trust law in a century, and having listened to the evidence brought forward, it's clear that this much-needed modernisation will provide clarity and make the law in this area more user-friendly. While it stops short of a full codification of trust law, what it has done is capture those areas on which there is broad consensus. And given that this is a Scottish Law Commission bill that's come through the DPLR committee, it probably strikes the right balance. I know during the Stage 1 debate there was some discussion about whether it could have done more, both in terms of trusts and in terms of succession. I think the way it's come to this Parliament explains why some aspects of the bill are more modest, as it's sought to be less political, less controversial, and to look at moving the law forward, because like a great many areas that this Parliament has responsibility for, that don't always appeal to politicians, these sort of bills can find it difficult to get chamber time, and I do welcome the process that's now in place with the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. And obviously no one is ever wishing for more work for themselves, but I think as a committee we've been able to work well, and it's given the committee a new area of interest. I only have one outstanding significant concern in relation to the bill, and that is around how public awareness raising will be taken forward. It was a theme again of that Stage 1 debate, and these are very significant changes to trust law, and it's exactly how those changes are going to be communicated to many of the smaller charities, organisations and individuals who operate in this space, many of whom have been doing the same thing for a long time, many of whom on the passage of this bill will likely get updated professional advice. And I think the Law Society are right when they highlight in their briefing for today that a comprehensive publicity and awareness-raising campaign for trustees, their professional advisors and the wider public in interacting with trusts is essential. And we've seen through the passage of this bill, it's not always the most interesting kind of area that captures everyone's kind of interest straight away. So I do recognise there is some difficulty in getting people, getting people to engage, and that was even the case, with some stakeholders and some people working, within this area itself. That people don't always have the time and energy, and I think sometimes in this Parliament we can think that everybody's watching and listening to every word that's passed, and they pick up, even within the legal profession, every bill that gets passed. So I'd be keen later in the debate to hear more from the Minister in that regard. That said, I'm sure unexpected challenges and unintended consequences may arise as a result of these changes. They are, as has been said, significant. And I think we have to do better in future at scrutinising the success of legislation we pass and to evaluate whether or not it actually delivers the changes set out. I could, Presiding Officer, go back through all of the things that the bill does, but I think the Minister set that out herself pretty comprehensively. So as I close, I would simply suggest that as a Parliament we do not wait another century to review the law in this area, and given its significance and central importance both financially and to Scottish society, that it's an area we pay a bit more interest to. So in closing, I'd simply like to thank all those at the Scottish Law Commission, the many witnesses and organisations who've given their time and energies to get the bill to this point today. I know at times it must seem like a thankless task and deeply frustrating when your area of expertise and legal practice is not always given the attention it deserves. And I hope that the passage of this bill, provided colleagues do support it, and I urge them to do so, does show that these processes do work and are worthwhile, and the many reports that the Scottish Law Commission have spent time on now seem to be proceeding with pace. So I'll leave it there and just say thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. I now call Rhoda Grant, around 5 minutes. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I also want to thank the committee clerks and all those involved in bringing forward this bill. It is a technical bill, but it will have real impacts on people's lives. Hopefully it will stop issues such as McClure's. The solicitors McClure's went into administration 2 years ago, and the victims of McClure's Action Group held a meeting for MSPs in the Parliament to raise awareness of the seriousness of the issues that were faced by clients of McClure's. Many of them have family protection trusts as well as wills, lasting powers of attorney and the like. There are an estimated 100,000 clients who are affected, and the vast majority of those people are totally unaware of the issues stemming from McClure's going into administration. Clients that have trusts with McClure's solicitors as trustees can often not sell assets because the solicitors are still on land registry records. This results in some property standing empty for 2 to 5 years, forcing families to maintain properties without being able to take any action such as sell or rent them. Campaigners of the Victims Action Group highlighted issues with accessing and understanding documents, and many of the clients are now elderly. Often it will be their children or close family who are left trying to make sense of everything, whilst the responsibility for looking after elderly parents, or indeed worse, going through a period of grief at the same time. Campaigners spoke of having to pay £750 administration fees to get McClure's trustees to sign off trusts, at the same time as receiving letters from solicitors trying to indemnify McClure's and their associates from any future legal action. The experience of those individuals highlights the human impact of what happens when trusts are not administered or managed appropriately, and lessons must be learned and processes put into place to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And hopefully this legislation does that, but those impacted by McClure's need help now. And so I would ask the Scottish Government to look at this, because Police Scotland won't get involved, the Law Society won't get involved, Scottish Legal Complaints Commission will not get involved. Someone needs to set up an investigation and make sure those affected are assisted properly and get the appropriate settlement to their concerns.
Bob Doris.
I'm very grateful for the member giving way. The victims of McClure's would also state that most people who have been let down by McClure's as yet don't know they're victims, and it's vastly underreported. Do you share my concerns that for years to come this could continue to unravel and they need some serious attention now?
Rhoda Grant.
Yep, I absolutely agree with Bob Doris, and also pay tribute to him for giving voice to the victims of McClure's and inviting them to the Parliament to speak to MSPs. So I absolutely agree with that, and I would urge the Scottish Government to act to support those people. The Minister said the bill will make things better for spouses and civil partners who die without a will. And it was also highlighted that work needed to be carried out on making sure there were better protection for cohabitees, people who had not formalised their relationships. And with societal changes, that is more and more common, where people have been together for a long period of time, have raised families, have grandchildren together, but do not have a will and are not protected in any way. And on that vein, I would encourage the government to ensure that people are aware that they should have wills and they should have power of attorney, because family need to know what they expect and family need to be protected when somebody dies. And this is not for someone at the end of life. The moment someone has dependents or is in a relationship with someone else that they would wish to protect, they need to set those things in order so that their loved ones can better represent their wishes should the worst happen. Can I just finish, Presiding Officer, by paying tribute to the Law Commission? They do a power of work, valuable work, looking at the law and looking to update it. Much of their work goes unnoticed and quite often not coming before this Parliament when it should. And it's timely that this bill is now coming, but there is more of their work that needs to be looked at. So we need to, maybe as a Parliament, look at how we deal with Law Commission work to make sure it gets the attention it deserves and that our law remains up to date. And with that, I will finish. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Grant. We now move to the open debate. I call for Stuart McMillan to be followed by Maggie Chapman. Around 4 minutes, Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, just to touch upon the McClure situation. I started to raise this in the committee because of constituents actually came to me with their concerns, some who certainly have been seriously affected. One point of caution I would urge colleagues is that when having dialogue with constituents, please give them factually accurate information. The SLCC is the organisation to do the complaints, not the Law Society of Scotland. With that, I mean, I'm hosting an event on the 15th of January in my constituency for constituents to actually come along because of the situation that the constituents have faced because of McClure's. So I would urge other colleagues to do likewise if they actually have a large number of people in their patches who have raised the issue with them. But saying also at the outset, I'd like to echo the comments from others with regards to the SLC and their work in the bill, and also for supporting the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee scrutiny of the bill. The extension of the remit of the DPLRC has been an important advancement in the Parliament for helping to deal with the SLC reports that have been completed, but time had not managed to be found in Parliament to implement the legislative changes that have been suggested, something at a point that Oliver Mundell touched upon earlier. The DPLRC is supportive of the role it has in scrutinising certain SLC bills. In the last year, the committee has led on 2 SLC bills, movable transactions, and also this one. And in 2024, the committee will be embarking on another SLC bill, which has just been introduced, the Judicial Factors Scotland Bill. Now, that bill is long overdue, with some aspects of the present law dating back to 1690. Now, today, I'm not speaking as the convener of the committee, but I know colleagues past and present who have had the pleasure of serving on the committee encourage the Scottish Government to continue to keep the pipeline of the SLC bills coming. The committee is always ready to scrutinise those which meet the criteria for the consideration by the committee. I would also say gently to whips of all parties that members serving some time on the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee would actually provide a greater understanding of some of the vital and sometimes unnoticed work that takes place in this Parliament. In my opinion, the DPLRC and also the Public Audit Committees provide those 2 invaluable experiences. I would like to thank those who contributed to the committee's scrutiny of the bill, whether in writing or by appearing before the committee during one of the evidence sessions. We are very grateful for the time and energy given to help the committee in its work. I'd also like to thank committee members for their scrutiny of the bill. We do work well together, as Oliver Mundell touched upon, in scrutinising all the bills that we encounter. And we all have got the same goal of attempting to improve them, to ensure that good laws are created. Oliver Mundell touched upon the trust and succession. Over 100 years this law has been in existence. Certainly I do encourage the present and future Scottish Governments, whatever their colour, to ensure that it's not another 100 years that this is changed. I also know that our work actually is noticed within the relevant business sectors, as the feedback does actually come back to the committee from time to time. I'd also like to thank the Minister and her team for the way that they have worked with the committee to get the best possible outcome for this bill. That collegiate approach has been appreciated by everyone in the committee. And finally, I want to thank the first-class clerking team that we have. I know that they enjoy the scrutiny of the SLC bills, as it also provides another experience other than the secondary legislation that we deal with every single Tuesday. They assist us tremendously well and they deserve the recognition for their dedication. Now, the committee actually has had some successes during the course of the Stage 2 and also Stage 3 scrutiny. For example, now following the amendment of Stage 2, the bill includes the following provisions which were recommended by the committee. Incapacity. Explicit reference to the right of a trustee deemed incapable by fellow trustees to go to court to challenge the decision. Also, the definition of incapacity is now able to easily be updated in the bill, anticipating upcoming changes to this area of law in the context of the final report of the Scottish Mental Health Law Review. The second point is the ethical investment. Following representations at Stage 1 and amendments at Stage 2, the bill now makes it clear that unless the legal document creating the trust says otherwise, ethical, social and environmental considerations are relevant when trustees are choosing between otherwise comparable and suitable investments. And the committee hopes that this is a small but tangible step towards helping us on our net zero journey. And my amendment today will also help provide some additional safeguards to help protect the integrity of trusts and also trustees. The committee also recommended that the bill should be amended to clarify that the law does not permit an unlawful killer to be an executor of the victim's estate. That new Section 6A and 73A of the bill, inserted at Stage 2, deal with those convicted of or being prosecuted for murder or culpable homicide. They clarify that such individuals are unfit to be the executor of the victim's estate and as such can be removed from this role by the court. Now, Presiding Officer, the committee recommended as a priority the timely implementation of the Section 104 order of the Scotland Act 1998. This is something that's come up not just in this bill but also the Movable Transactions Bill. Thankfully, the discussions are well underway between both Scottish and UK governments, and it's something that I know all committee members are very pleased with that. But certainly we hope that this is commenced as soon as possible. And with that, I will conclude, Presiding Officer, and look forward to supporting the Trusts and Succession Scotland Bill tonight at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McMillan. I now call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Bill Kidd. Around 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by thanking the Scottish Law Commission for their detailed and technical work over more than a decade on the different elements of this bill. I'm grateful to the Law Society for their work and suggestions, the briefings I've received from them and the conversations we've had about this area of law. And I put on record my thanks to Stuart McMillan and the whole Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their consideration and scrutiny work. Scottish Greens welcome this technical legislation that seeks to deal with the complexities that over a century of acts and amendments have created. This reform and consolidation is the most significant development in trust law for over 100 years. It's intended to simplify our trusts and succession law and make it easier for solicitors, trusters, trustees and beneficiaries to understand their legal rights and duties. During the Stage 1 debate of this bill, I raised the need to ensure trusts support positive environmental and social objectives to enhance our environment and community well-being. I also stated that on landholding trusts, we believe in the Scottish Greens that offshore trusts, blind trusts and private trusts that exist for tax avoidance or ownership secrecy should not be allowed to hold land. Primary beneficiaries of landholding trusts should demonstrate the productive use or development of land for good while being locally accountable and accessible. We also want our succession law to support collective benefit and fair inheritance principles and not to be used to further contribute to Scotland's land problem. We remain concerned about the historic inequalities that are embedded in the structures and concentrated patterns of land ownership, and powers within succession law must be considered as part of our wider land reform for community benefit considerations. However, perhaps these issues go beyond some of the technical parameters of the bill we discussed today. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I just want to reiterate my thanks to those who have got us to where we are today. I look forward to supporting this bill at decision time and also to an update on the Section 104 discussions that Stuart McMillan has referred to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call Bill Kidd. Again, around 4 minutes. Mr Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And as a member of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, I spoke in the debate on the proposed Trust and Succession Scotland Bill in September at Stage 1, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to update the Chamber on the process of the proposed bill at Stage 3 for consideration. I would like to thank all the members of the committee and, of course, all committee clerks and the legal team for their excellent work on the bill at Stage 2, noting as well the overwhelmingly positive contribution of the many witnesses, and in particular the work of the Scottish Law Commission for their invaluable efforts prior to the introduction of the bill, and their ongoing support and research to ensure that the bill meets the aims and objectives of the proposals in a comprehensive manner, enabling it to be passed by this chamber here at Stage 3. The bill, when enacted, will be the most significant development in trust law for over 100 years, continuing and extending the use of Scotland as a favourable jurisdiction for trusts. In my contribution at Stage 1, I made note of concerns raised by stakeholders about the bill's default position on the personal liability of trustees for court expenses in cases in which the trust property is insufficient to cover any such costs. And the committee's view was that the starting point should be that there is no personal liability on the part of the trustees for expenses unless a court deems otherwise. I'm happy that amendments made to this section at Stage 2 to remove personal liability for trustees where the trust property is insufficient to meet the expenses of litigation were passed by the committee and added to the bill in its final version. I also noted concerns regarding the bill's potential interaction with Scotland's journey to net zero and assured the Chamber that the committee would work with the Scottish Government to amend the bill to explicitly allow trustees, subject to the terms of the trust deed, to choose to invest in ESG investments. Happily, a new section 17A of the bill inserted at Stage 2 covers trustees' powers to invest. It makes it clear that unless the legal document creating the trust says otherwise, ethical, social and environmental considerations are relevant when trustees are choosing between otherwise comparable and suitable investments. The committee also recommended that the Scottish and UK governments pursue the implementation of a Section 104 order to apply the changes proposed in the bill to pension scheme trusts in order to ensure the smooth running of the bill. And I welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to work with the UK Government to bring forward such an order. One final point raised by the Law Society of Scotland is that given the changes set out in the bill represent very significant changes to trust law, it is essential that implementation is accompanied by a comprehensive publicity and awareness-raising campaign for trustees, their professional advisers and the wider public interacting with trusts. And I look forward to hearing the Government's plans in this regard. Finally, Presiding Officer, given that this will be my final debate in Parliament of 2023, thank you, I would just like to wish everyone here and all my constituents in Glasgow and East Land all the best for 2024. Thank you.
Like hitting the microphone with your papers, there are other ways of gaining the Chamber's attention. We now move to the closing speeches, and I invite Martin Whitfield. Around 4 minutes, Mr Whitfield.
I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I think the most recent attempt at awakening the Chamber was more successful than your whacking the microphone. Scottish Labour are in agreement and will support this bill later this afternoon because, as we've heard from a number of contributions both during the amendment stage and in this final debate, it has been probably far too long since a Parliament took a look at this, and thanks have to go to the Scottish Law Commission for the work that they have done quietly in the background, slightly more forcibly and even slightly more forcibly to bring this forward, and also the support from interested parties from the Law Society and the advocates and others who've responded to this. I, like others, would like to thank the committee for the huge work they did, both the members of the committee and the clerks that surround them and give support. But I'd also like to thank and put on the record the work of Stuart McMillan with regard to this particular bill and his ongoing interest in it, because often the conveners go unthanked in this chamber, and experience tells me, and indeed knowledge of speaking with Stuart about the work that he's brought to this, working with the government, and it's to the great thanks of the government that the bill has been improved with cross-party support. But to thank Stuart McMillan for his work in relation to this. There's a number of matters that it would be nice to hear in summing up, which have been hinted at, and I just want to draw attention to those. The first was raised both by Bill Kidd and Oliver Mundell about the importance of an awareness campaign. We've heard about the importance of wills and the power of attorney, the ease and pressure it can lift on families if dealt with at the appropriate times. And I think it would be, in that old-fashioned phrase, money well spent, to raise awareness both from MSPs to their constituents when they have the opportunity, but also wider and through the government to point out the importance of both vehicles, power of attorney and wills, so that choices can be made by people when they're able to make those choices without some of the crisis that can happen when it occurs either too late in the day or so late that actually there are concerns about the validity of those who are casting them. So it would be nice to hear from the Minister in summing up about that. I'd also like just to return in the short time that I have to the amendment that I intervened on, which is in respect of section 19 now as amended within the bill, about the regulations about what a good cause could be and whether there are any actual specific good cause identifiers that the government are considering to bring in by way of subsequent legislation. That would indeed be helpful. And in summing up, because it's nice to have a bill that there is an agreement across this chamber on, and a bill that we've seen improve through its process, and indeed, as Oliver Mundell pointed out, a bill that maybe can come back through post-legislative scrutiny sooner rather than in 110 years' time, that we can seek to make improvements. I will leave it at that stage, but just once again to express my thanks to all of those who have been involved. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Jeremy Balfour for around 5 minutes. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Hopefully you will hear some of his speech from where I'm taking part this afternoon. Because I am pleased to be able to speak today at the stage 3 of this important piece of legislation. As others have commented, it is over 100 years since we have seen a change in this law. I'm aware that for many people, and perhaps even some of my fellow colleagues, this can seem like a pretty dry read. It can seem a very technical bill that doesn't have an impact on the day-to-day lives of our constituents. But even so, I think it is an important bill that will be welcomed by many people, especially those within the legal profession and those who execute trusts and wills. I think that, broadly speaking, we have before us a good piece of legislation, and I look forward to it passing in a few minutes' time. A number of my colleagues have addressed a number of the issues which have come up, but I think it is important to see how this bill has improved, both by members and by the government engaging constructively. And so I want to thank the Minister for her work on my amendments, which I believe have improved the bill even this afternoon. But one disappointment I have is that we still haven't gone far enough on the law of succession. Now, I understand, as my colleague said, Oliver Mundell said, we don't want a controversial or political bill, but I do hope that within the next 100 years, we will see more radical reform of the succession law, which still has many outdated provisions which aren't fit for the 21st century. I know that the Scottish Government are going to consult on this, and I hope that the next Parliament will pass a bill on that. Presiding Officer, I also want to thank those who have helped us as a committee and a Parliament get to where we are today. The Scottish Law Commission, the committee team, the witnesses, and those who helped draft amendments. I suspect this won't get much coverage in the media tomorrow or in the days ahead, but I do believe this bill will and can make a difference to individual lives for the better here in Scotland, and I look forward to supporting it in a few minutes' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call on Siobhan Brown to wind up to 6 minutes, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank those members who have contributed to this afternoon's debate. There is general consensus that the law in Scotland on trusts is outdated, and the changes proposed in the bill would make a significant and positive difference for those who use trusts in Scotland. I hope it is clear that we've listened carefully to what has been said by stakeholders and by the committee and other MSPs during stages 1 and 2. Trust law may sound remote and dusty, but it's important to recognise that the law on trusts impacts many of us. Trusts have an everyday utility and put simply, they are an important means of managing assets for people. For example, if you are a client of a travel agent or a solicitor, your payments may be held in a form of trust. You may set up a trust to control and protect your family assets, or when someone's too young to handle their affairs or have suffered a serious personal injury. As the number of blended families increase, a trust can help manage assets between complicated and sometimes difficult family relationships. I hope that it is clear too that this bill matters. It matters to all those involved in trusts in Scotland, whether that is a trustor, a beneficiary or a trustee. What the bill does in terms of making things simpler and fit for modern-day purposes would be of great benefit to those involved in trusts. If the bill is passed today, and I sincerely hope it will be, there is still a lot of work to be done before the provisions will be capable of coming into effect. We heard during Stage 1 evidence sessions how important it is, given the significant value and the fact that there is sizable pensions industry in Scotland, that pension trusts are included in these reforms. Work has been underway for some time to engage with the UK Government on the necessary Section 104 order under the Scotland Act 1998 to ensure that we won't be left with a black hole in the law and that pension trusts here will benefit from these reforms. There is more work to do and we are committed to doing it. I mentioned earlier Jeremy Balfour's amendment relating to cohabitation. Whilst I was happy to support it, I did make clear that we would not plan to bring into force this particular part of the legislation until such time as the other issues encountered by those attempting to apply for financial provision on the death of a cohabitee are considered further and, if necessary, addressed. I have written to the committee setting out my intention to consult on these issues as part of a wider consultation on recommendations made in the Scottish Law Commission's report on cohabitation, and I intend for this to be published by the summer of 2024. There have been questions raised throughout the bill's passage about wider reforms to the law of succession going forward. This was never the legislative vehicle for any such reforms. The Scottish Law Commission has produced reports on the issue, and we have subsequently consulted on several occasions now. It was clear that there was no agreement amongst stakeholders, and given the fact that the area of intestate law has a potential to impact on all of us, it's very important that we take time to get it right. Over the last couple of years, we've been pleased to fund work which has been carried out under the auspices of the Scottish Civil Justice Hub to gather data and evidence, including the attitudes of the public, and to carry out research which can be used to inform policy. This is not an area of law that has been forgotten, quite the contrary. The work has been ongoing and will continue, and I'm happy to keep the committee updated on progress. Importantly, the bill incorporates powers so that we have the tools and the flexibility to ensure that provisions can be kept up to date. For example, the committee at its Stage 1 consideration recommended that it would be desirable to consider flexibility in the bill to alter the types of trust applications that may be considered by the Sheriff and those that may be considered by the Court of Session. The Scottish Government therefore brought forward a Stage 2 amendment to allow the Scottish ministers to vary the definition of court so that either the Sheriff Court or the Court of Session can consider different types of trust applications. Another example is a definition of incapable. The bill sets out the circumstances in which a person is to be regarded as incapable for the purposes of the bill. It aligns the definition in the bill with the wider incapacity legislation in Scotland. In recognition that there are significant and far-reaching changes recommended to mental health legislation and that the precise nature of the changes that may be made in the future cannot be anticipated, the bill was amended at Stage 2 to provide Scottish ministers with a power to amend the definition of incapable to ensure that there was sufficient flexibility to allow trust law to keep pace with the evolving understanding of incapacity. Presiding Officer, if I could just get to a few points that have been raised during the debate today. Oliver Mundell, Bill Kidd and Martin Whitfield did raise the importance of public awareness. One of the things I do know through discussions with my officials and the Law Society of Scotland, I understand the Law Society intend to publicise the changes brought about by the bill with its members, who are likely to comprise of a significant number of professional trustees and professional advisors to Scottish Trust, but I am happy to work with the profession to agree what further guidance or awareness is necessary. I know Rhoda Grant and Martin Whitfield echoed the importance of people making wills and powers of attorney, and I think in our positions as MSPs we should all be highlighting this to our constituents wherever possible. Moving on to section 19 and the good causes that Martin Whitfield raised, discussions with the law firm CMS Cameron McKenna about covering the ring-fence asset is a specific example of the section 19. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would like to repeat my thanks to all of those who have given evidence to help improve the bill during its parliamentary process, and I commend the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Trusts and Succession Scotland Bill. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 11616 in the name of Martin Whitfield on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments